Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to contribute to this urgent and important debate. I would like to start pointing out some problems we have with the existing fiscal rules. I know you all know these problems, but just to spotlight some of them, and then in a second step to ask what measures can be implemented to mitigate them. As I read the draft of the EESC opinion, many of these points are already in there. Nevertheless, I would like to point out the most important things here. Well, let me start the problems of the existing rules. And I would like to point out four here. The first is that the rules have, or at least the application of the rules, have a pro-cyclical bias. This stems from the problems we have with the computation of the cyclical component of the budget deficit and the focus on the structural budget balance in adjustment processes. And because we cannot measure the structural budget, but we need the cyclical component, the problems from the cyclical component lead to pro-cyclical policies. Revisions here of this component are often in a way that makes a pro-cyclical tightening or pro-cyclical necessary or pro-cyclical losing possible, and this is something which should be addressed. The second problem we have is that the current rules give an incentive for cutting investment instead of public consumption, because these two components are treated the same way in the rules, or almost the same way. And because cutting investment doesn't, or usually isn't felt by the electorate as quickly as cutting transfers or consumption, politicians have a prejudice or have a bias towards cutting investment under these rules. A third problem we have observed over the past years is that these rules impose excessive austerity on some countries, especially those who already have a high debt to GDP ratio, because the 120 rule forces them to very strongly reduce this debt to GDP ratio each year. And this problem is going to be worse after the COVID-19 crisis because debt levels have risen. Fourth, we have excessive complexity in these rules, and I know you all probably have looked at the vademecum, but when I talk to officials from the member states or even parliamentarians, hardly anyone really knows the rules of the vademecum. And I mean, the last edition is 100 pages of very technical rules. The early editions were already a bit more, so it's understandable that it's difficult to follow them. So what can we do? And I would like to propose three, or focus on three reform elements to mitigate these problems. And at least according to what we have worked on, and my colleague René Repasi will elaborate on that, these things can be implemented within the current treaties. So there would be no need for a treaty change for these elements. Well, the first element would be an expenditure rule for non-cyclical, non-investment expenditure. And the idea here is that countries which has an excessive debt level, they have to cap the growth of nominal expenditure to a rate below the potential nominal growth rate. The degree how much this should be limited depends on the distance from the debt anchor or the debt limit. This is less pro-cyclical and smoother than the rules we have now, because the revisions to estimated potential growth rates are usually much smaller than the revisions to the level of potential output and hence the cyclical component. Especially such a revision would only refer to future expenditure growth and does not change your position where you are in the cycle from year to year. Of course, if parameters are set badly in an expenditure rule, it still could impose excessive austerity. Hence, you need to be careful with setting the parameters, and you would need some safeguards, especially to make sure that no cuts in real terms are mandated by this expenditure rules. Second, I would propose a limit to to have this rule only until a certain level of structural surplus is reached, a primary surplus is reached. Beyond that, if you further limit expenditure growth, then you get a very strange oscillating process of deficits and the debt level. Of course, you also need to be careful which debt level you apply here, because if it's too low and too far away from what's realistic, then you also have excessive austerity. Second, I would propose a golden rule for investment. because investment expenditure is not covered by the expenditure rules, we would allow for borrowing for net to finance net investment. Here, this could be capped at 1% of GDP or 1.5% of GDP in order to make sure to be in line with the 3% limit of the Maastricht Treaty. And the logic is here that because you can expect that additional public investment increases output, as long as fiscal returns are above interest rates, which is the case now and for the foreseeable future, such investment financed by debt improves debt sustainability, and therefore it should be allowed. This takes away the political economy incentive to reach fiscal targets by cutting investment expenditure. Third, we would propose a change in the debt limit or the debt target. The Maastricht Treaty was written in a period of high real interest rates. At that point, 60% seemed to be a sensible debt limit. However, we are in a different world now. All developed countries have, or all major developed countries have a much higher debt level, and we have seen that it's sustainable and one can live with a much higher debt level. And therefore, one should try to reform this debt level. At low interest rates, it's really a negative for other economies to push for debt to GDP level far below the sustainability, because then you would have to finance expenditure by taxes, even though you could finance with negative interest rates, which is much cheaper and for the government. This could be done without a treaty change. However, you would have to have a unanimous vote on it according to the treaty. And I stop here. The three proposals are both in, or the three elements are both in our proposal for reform and in some variation in the European Fiscal Board's proposals as well. Thank you very much.
Dear Mr. President, dear members of the committee, dear colleagues, thanks a lot for having invited me and for giving me the undoable challenge to say something about the legal framework on fiscal rules within 5 minutes. I will nevertheless try to face the challenge and basically do it by pointing out basics, foundations that we have to look at. Because let's say what makes the task easier is that treaty change is excluded. In a sense, we want to look what can be done below the need for treaty change. And here the thing is that we have a huge amount of rules when we come to fiscal policy coordination, to budgetary supervision, but they are all in secondary or even in tertiary law, code of conduct, etc. So they are basically all open to change without the need for ratification. And that makes it that we can actually focus on what are the fundamental limits that we find in the treaty framework. So those that can actually not be touched at, if we look at the task that is now given A to this presentation and B also to the report. And the first thing in terms of foundations that we have to recall, as you know, but it's always worth to recall it, that the treaty framework on fiscal policy coordination is based on two pillars. The excessive deficit procedure under 126 of the treaty, and in secondary law, the corrective arm. And before there is excessive deficit, the preventive arm. And here important to see is that the corrective arm, so the excessive deficit procedure, that is the one that we find in the treaty. And here the treaty makes clear the European Union and its political institutions have more far-reaching rights in order to interfere with national budgetary sovereignty. If we are, however, below the excessive deficit, then we are in a totally different logic. Then we are in the logic of Article 121 or economic policy coordination. And here the treaties made it very clear in terms of distribution of competences that member states remain fully competent and sovereign with regard to their decisions. The EU is only coordinating it and may address non-binding recommendations to it. So national parliaments remain sovereign in there. You see this also in the legal consequences. If before there's an excessive deficit, a national parliament ignores whatever comes from the European Union, they only run the risk of interest-bearing deposits and even this sanction is at least legally disputed. Let me quickly dispel some myths with regard to the treaty framework. First, there is this notion of the rule-based fiscal framework. Yet, the only and most important imperative treaty requirement that cannot be circumvented by whatever is done in secondary law or by means of communication is avoiding excessive deficits as required by Article 126, paragraph 1. The treaty does, however, not provide for any precise definition of what this is. So we actually can speak here of a standard. The transgression of the well-known reference values 3 or 60%, they only, legally speaking, trigger the preparation of a commission report. It doesn't say anything whether there is excessive deficit. And those reference values are in the protocol, which can be changed even without treaty change, because paragraph 14 of 126 empowers the union institutions to do so. Yet unanimity is required. Ultimately, it's the council that determines in a political decision whether there is an excessive deficit without being obliged to. So that all makes clear when we look at excessive deficits. This is a highly political procedure which was given shape in terms of secondary law, but it also allows us to conclude that there's a lot of political discretion in order to change the system as long as excessive deficits are avoided. So what we see under the rule-based approach, that is actually laid down in secondary law and therefore subject to changes. This is the medium-term objective. This is the adjustment path towards it, and the possibility to temporarily deviate from this adjustment path. So that can be changed. Moreover, there is the elephant in the room, the Fiscal Compact. Now, the Fiscal Compact is an international treaty, but it is only concluded amongst member states. It is therefore only an alternative, a competing alternative to secondary law. Hence, under EU law, it is hierarchically subject to changes in secondary law. If we change the Stability and Growth Pact, then the Fiscal Compact has to follow or is to be disapplied by national courts. Stricter rules than in secondary law are possible, yet if there are significant changes done in secondary law, those changes overrule the Fiscal Compact. With a very quick remark on the elements of reform that were mentioned. Expenditure rule that Professor Dullien mentioned. Here, we see that the assessment under this expenditure rule should exclusively be based on debt levels. The necessary element is that we have a rule that requires a sufficient diminishment of debt above the reference value. But please note, there is no relief from the deficit criterion under 126.2. So even if you go for a debt anchor, there is an upper limit in terms of deficit. The preventive arm knows already an expenditure rule, but that one is linked to a structural balance, so the medium-term objective. So it must be changed if there is an efficient expenditure rule. The golden rule should quickly be mentioned, as the Stability and Growth Pact knows already a structural reform clause and an investment clause. But they are less comprehensive in terms of scope than the golden rule that Professor Dullien was presenting. Yet there is a possibility to extend the protection of public investments under Stability and Growth Pact, provided that there is some sort of credible legal safety margin to the deficit criteria. Short and quick conclusions. The treaty allows for significant changes to the EU fiscal framework. It is ultimately only the requirement to avoid excessive deficits that puts the upper limit, the precise content of which is not defined by the treaties and therefore open to political, read procedural implementation. This is where the political margin of maneuver stems from, and that makes it that there is a lot of procedure that are needed in order to give flesh to this criterion. And whenever procedures are needed, we need to respect first institutional balance within the EU, but also between the EU and member states, and national parliaments can just not be sidelined. The main danger of all reform proposals is that each proposal for itself looks well, but all measures together might lead to a structural transgression of the deficit criterion, especially when it comes to high debt countries. So any reform that we are looking at needs to have credible safety margins with regard to the excessive deficit threshold, but these safety margins allow still way more margin of maneuver than the current framework in the secondary law. I hope I met my challenge to do it in, now it's 7 minutes as well, but thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to comments and the discussion.
morning, members of the committee and study group, everybody in the audience. My name is Alicia Hinarejos. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this hearing on reshaping the EU fiscal framework. And thank you for allowing me to do so via pre-recorded video, given the time difference. Now, there's a general consensus, and there has been for some time, that the fiscal framework needs to be reformed. The Commission agreed and launched its economic governance review in February 2020. Its report at the time was very critical, finding that the current economic and fiscal framework was not effective, lacked transparency and credibility. In the meantime, both the review and the fiscal framework itself are on hold because of the pandemic. Consensus is that while it may not be easy to secure agreement, reforms should take place before budgetary surveillance comes back into full force, possibly in 2023. But the focus of this hearing so far has been on one specific element of the framework for economic and fiscal governance, fiscal rules. I follow the interventions by Professor Dullien and Professor Repasi, who have focused on reforms to the fiscal rules that are possible without treaty changes. These scholars' report is outstanding and comprehensive, and I agree with the legal analysis. I will just say a few words about the suggested reforms, which span from amending aspects of the fiscal rules to getting rid of them completely and just using looser standards that we define on a case-by-case basis. I will focus on the reforms to aspects of the fiscal rules first. When thinking about what would need to be changed in order to adopt these reforms, the thing that we should bear in mind is that the overarching treaty requirement is simply to avoid excessive deficit and ensure sustainability of public finances within the currency union. In deciding what excessive is, the treaty just says that both deficit and government debt should be taken into consideration. Specific values are not set in the treaty itself, but only in the protocol annexed to the treaties, the protocol on the excessive deficit procedure. Now, this protocol can be changed by unanimity. So the treaty gives us quite some leeway. Now, when it comes to these specific reforms to fiscal rules, it's mainly secondary legislation that would need to be amended and the protocol annexed to the treaties in some cases. But the treaty itself would allow for all of them. A debt anchor or expenditure rules could be put into place without treaty changes, just amending secondary legislation. Reform of the rules on government debt. You cannot remove these rules completely, but you can change them, relax them. You will need to change the reference value in the protocol attached to the treaties, but no treaty reform would need to be undertaken. Plus, you would have to change the secondary legislation. And just to be clear, the values defined here would not have to be uniform for all member states. If you wanted to create more room for public investment through a golden rule, again, the treaty would not stand in the way of that. You would just need to amend secondary legislation. Now, let me say something about the proposals for doing away with fiscal rules altogether in favor of fiscal standards, which would likely need a treaty reform. One, it may well be that economically, standards make a lot more sense than fiscal rules. That is not my area of expertise. It's also true that numerical fiscal rules are clear and foreseeable. But this has been a bit of a pretense in the past, given that in the end, enforcement is up to the Council, who has a very broad discretion. There has been no effective enforcement of these numerical fiscal rules in the past. You could just say it's more honest or straightforward to do away with them altogether and just have standards that we define and apply on a case-by-case basis. Now, the first problem here is the broad discretion to be afforded to expert bodies, either fiscal councils or the Commission, in defining by themselves the rules to be applied in each case. I think this comes down to having to separate standards themselves from their enforcement. It may be acceptable to give this broad discretion to expert bodies as long as it cannot lead to any binding decision. But then arguably this would look quite different from the mechanism of fiscal discipline envisaged in the treaty, and you may have to amend it. But the proponents of this change would go further than this, arguing that these decisions should be binding. and that there can be judicial control of these pronouncements. Now, I think this is a no-go, as Professors Dullien and Repasi argue in their paper. In practice, the Court of Justice would show deference to these expert bodies and exercise a light touch review only. And we would have a legitimacy problem with these decisions taken by expert bodies exercising enormous discretion in the definition of the standards to be applied and limiting national budgetary autonomy to a degree that would be unacceptable, including to national constitutional courts. Now, against this background, it seems far more feasible to focus on reforming fiscal rules, at least in a short to mid-term scenario, rather than on getting rid of them altogether. Beyond specific fiscal rules, the wider reform of the European semester, I agree, should aim for more inclusion of parliaments, EU and national and social partners, to increase ownership and legitimacy. And more needs to be done to ensure the centrality of the social pillar within this framework. And I'd like to finish by reminding us that we should be mindful of the limitations of any multi-level fiscal framework that relies exclusively on fiscal discipline and coordination of national fiscal policies in the absence of a meaningful fiscal capacity at the central level. In other words, arrangements for surveillance and coordination of national fiscal policies will always be limited in what they can achieve. Their reform should be part of a more ambitious EMU reform that includes the creation of a permanent fiscal capacity for the EU or the euro area. That way, we wouldn't need to rely on member states' economic and fiscal policies to deal with large shocks on their own. We wouldn't have to place so much emphasis on discipline. Additionally, a central fiscal capacity could create incentives or carrots for member states to comply with fiscal and economic recommendations without the need to resort to disciplinary enforcement, which seems not to have worked well so far. Now, this is, of course, a longer-term reform, and it is right for the time being to focus on a more pressing, more limited reform of the fiscal rules. But we should not forget its place within a broader, more ambitious plan. Thank you, and I remain at your disposal.